Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. If you've been around a while, you might know that the Mongols are one of the pieces of history that I am the most fascinated with. In fact, on many days, if pressed on the question of the thing I am most fascinated about in history, there are days I'm going to say it's the Mongols. So we got some Mongol content coming from our friend Cody at Alternate History Hub, and he's got one of the great alternate scenarios that could have happened regarding the Mongols, and that is, what if the Mongols had actually been successful at conquering Japan? Famous story that there was two invasions that both failed, much of that due to actual bad weather as their ships were destroyed. But yeah, what would happen if it was actually successful like they were in so many other places in the world? This video is going to be linked down below. Make sure you're supporting that. Give it a view, like, and of course, subscribe. By the way, if you like alternate history on my new original site, I've been working with an editor and a writer. And we've already begun an alternate history series when we got 2 episodes already up right now. Third one is being edited. And there's a couple stories already written. And those will be coming out in the near future. Again, Mr. Terry Originals, also linked down below. All right, let's get started.
Japan was saved by bad weather twice. A divine wind they called a kamikaze.
Kamikaze, it's right.
Kublai Khan threw everything he had against the shogunate, and his failure would lay the foundations of Japan as we know it today.
Yeah.
This invasion was so impactful that it redefined Japanese politics, culture, and religion forever. In the late 14th century, the biggest naval operation in human history, carrying over 150,000 Mongol horse archers, clashed against an elite force of samurai, honoring the Bushido Code.
You know, it's so fascinating because, you know, the Mongols were, a land power, but they were also incredibly innovative. They would win battle after battle in all types of different climates, right? In open battlefields and siege warfare. Against so many different places and cultures across the world. And you might think an obstacle, like, again, needing to cross the water, could possibly be their biggest challenge that they ever had. But they were up to the task under Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, who was trying to follow in the footsteps of his grandson, or of his grandfather. So investing in the biggest amphibious naval fleet ever. And you could tell this was not a small undertaking by them, not just by building ships, but also the incredible amount of soldiers that they're bringing there. The Mongols had already conquered China, which was an incredible thing that they had done. Conquering the Song dynasty, which was so vast and powerful. Now seeking, an island nation.
The Great Khan versus the Shogun. An epic encounter cut short by a raging typhoon.
Shogun's the military commander of Japan. Spot the lie on that last bit.
Which part is off? The century? The claim this amphibious assault dwarfed D-Day? Well, plot twist, it's all wrong. The Mongol invasions were barely Mongolian, maybe 3% at most.
Yeah.
But the brand was too catchy to ditch.
Sure.
Japanese chroniclers and YouTubers alike know the Sino-Goryeo Mongol invasions don't exactly roll off the tongue.
Sino referring to Japan, Goryeo meaning Korea. This is obviously going to be huge in Japanese culture. Anytime, a culture defeats an invading force, that brings so much national pride to a people. And although there wasn't a unified state in Japan at this time, that overall Japanese culture was so strong. Already had strong beliefs in their Shinto religion about nature and its power. And if you have, natural disasters and natural effects that actually benefit you, how could that not almost ingrain more into your belief system?
So this invasion goes by a different name, and it's drenched in propaganda for a reason.
Yep.
Beneath the inflated numbers and myths lies a gripping story that reshaped Japan.
I hadn't heard that number. Now, it also depends on which invasion you're talking about. There's going to be 2. First fails, try another one about, 8 years later? Second one being much, much larger than the first one.
An external force crushed by nature, yet burrowed deep.
Yeah, there's always a lot more than that.
Soul. The real ghost of Tsushima is the invisible enemy the islanders never stopped fighting.
Yeah. Tsushima, by the way, is an island kind of right in the middle between Korea and Japan. So naturally a place that, you would use as like a further launch pad amongst the major Japanese islands.
One that consumed and transformed them from within. That's why this alternate scenario is so compelling. A successful invasion rewrites Japan's DNA, potentially unraveling it entirely. But before we erase anime, let's rewind. Okay, so when I say Mongols, chances are you're thinking in one of three camps.
Okay.
Camp A, you don't know much besides them being a bunch of horse boys who like to throat sing and conquer everything. Camp B,
most people.
Khan fanboys, the Romabu equivalent here, convinced that the Mongols were the world's ultimate war machine. And Camp C, folks who wield the Mongol boogeyman to hype how badass their group was for stopping the unstoppable.
Sure. Put down a few groups with that. They'll lose to the Mamluks in the Middle East, down in Southeast Asia towards Vietnam. Then you got to say it differently, though, about Europe when the Mongols basically go back home. By the way, did a fun originals video about the Mongol invasion of Europe and them leaving. One of my favorite ones that we've made over on the originals channel.
Boogeyman to hype how badass their group was for stopping the unstoppable. You know who you are. Japan would undoubtedly fall into the latter, with arguably the strongest case alongside the Mamluks. Yeah. And to that I say, in your dreams. If you look at the tribes Temujin unified and how far he got them, and I mean really look, what you find is the equivalent of the Normans conquering all of Europe. I mean, that would be like if Cuba conquered all of the Americas. The Mongols were way better at conquering, but both people followed the same fate.
Why are you just picking those? Just a small group conquering other places. I mean, Cuba is an island nation, didn't have the military history, and the Mongols have an incredible contextual history with other civilizations, in the world at that time. And all the nomadic people of the steppe anyways, as there had always been little conquests and incursions and invasions into places, south of them, or there's China or towards Central Asia. A lot of that was driven by things like drought. They were pastoralists. They, moved around into grassy areas in the steppe of, Central and Northern Asia. Didn't practice mass agriculture, but were very dependent on, the climate where they were, but then also trade interactions with sedentary societies without them. It's always been, for the Mongols and their kind of like ancestral tree, a roller coaster of hot and cold relations with the sedentary civilizations south of them. So it's from that region why you're going to get like the Great Wall of China being built with the first Chinese empire.
They're kicked out of the land, but both people followed the same fate. Either kicked out of the lands they conquered, or in the best case scenario, integrated into the population. Yep. Genghis Khan's grandson didn't just choose the integration option. He furiously pursued it, seeing the right...
I feel like the scene... if you guys saw the Marco Polo scene, and finally at the end, it shows Kublai Khan sitting on the throne of the Song dynasty. I feel like this is almost like the final scene from that.
The integration option. He furiously pursued it. Seeing the writing on the wall, thanks to his badass mom, Kublai Khan was ready to sever all connections to his Mongol ancestry. Mongol culture. In pursuit of the mandate of heaven. His dream of the Yuan dynasty was busy work, and it required him to kowtow to all the different religions and cultural groups within China, establishing himself as the supreme emperor.
That was already the case, with the Mongols. Kublai Khan definitely had more of an expression about this multi-religious nature of, really everywhere around the Silk Road. Notoriously had people from different faiths, even very close to him, in his courts, because they interacted with Confucianists and Buddhists, Muslims, Christians. Kublai Khan's mother was, in fact, a Christian as well. He wasn't, but the Mongols did have a policy of religious toleration. A lot of that probably in part too, though, that Mongol religion itself is not one that tries to proselytize. It's not a universalizing religion. It's tied to their homeland. Not so much something that you convert to. And they didn't expect people to.
Sure, some generals and customs stayed Mongolian, but he walked and talked Han. You get the picture. The wider Mongol Empire.
It was actually, by the way, a big crit. I mean, Kublai had a lot of haters from the other powerful Mongols that he basically had to share power with, although he's going to be the emperor. Remember, Genghis has a lot of kids, right? There's a lot of people that want claims, and it's a vast empire, and it's still very tribal in that way. It's really more of a unified patchwork of different people. But one of the big criticisms is that Kublai was too Chinese, that he was almost like losing his Mongolness because of how obsessive he was with China, conquering it. That's where he's going to basically be operating new capital out of.
Only in name. Not that he cared, since it was stretching itself way too thin. Internally, he was doing all right.
Large.
But he still had the Southern Song, resisting his mandate in the South. Duh. Yeah. Kublai knew he couldn't
basically
get
put
his
under a
foot
military
off the
occupation.
gas, since the moment he did, China would do what China does best and implode in on itself. This video was sponsored by, well, you. Stick with me here. So, I have a lot of ideas for videos, and like 80% of them would just bomb on this channel. If I could just upload whatever and whenever I wanted, and it'd have no effect on the algorithm, I would do it. But sadly, that
Same
is
here
not
with
how
reaction
this
videos. Sorry,
platform
guys.
works. If less people watch your videos, YouTube just kills your channel.
Yep.
At the same time, I want these dumb videos to exist. Like, I had an idea imagining a world where the American buffalo just randomly respawned in America with their pre-19th century populations.
Okay.
Like, imagine that. Instead of there being just a few thousand bison today, one day, those vast herds just poof back into existence.
Sweet.
Imagine how much that would devastate the modern United States. Millions of bison, enough to black out the prairie.
How many are we talking
just
about?
retaking the Midwestern plains. Would anyone care about this? I don't know. But I do know that there would be a section of the audience that would, and they deserve full production value for that too.
You're getting
That's something that
Buffalo
can
lovers?
only really be done through Patreon. So yeah, this was a Patreon plug.
Buffalo
but wait,
folks.
there are so many unique videos on Patreon and now memberships that you've probably
how we have
never
like
seen.
the
More niche
Rome
topics,
obsessed people, they're
things that
Buffalo
just
obsessed
wouldn't
people.
fly on the main channel. If that's something that sounds good to you, then check it out. We got polls. You can vote for videos. It's pretty fun. Okay, back to the actual video.
That is fun. That's cool. Check that out, y'all.
What he needed was an external foe, a jewel which previous dynasties lost long ago.
Yeah.
Ideally,
Japan had
someone
never been
whose
taken over.
downfall would also contribute to success in the south. Japan fit every part of that bill. Its pirates were harassing shipments, merchants were trading with the Song, and should he be able to conquer them, his legitimacy would go through the roof. Based on the stories he heard, Japan was a place filled with riches and obedient servants. I guess the grass is always greener on the other side.
Maybe they just know about like Bushido and, again, the incredible amount of loyalty that they have. You can see that being very appealing to the Mongol kind of philosophy about loyalty. And they were so successful at basically creating loyal people. Now a lot of that's going to, of course, be by fear, but also them rewarding people who were loyal to them. So I guess in a way, it's almost like a challenge for them. Maybe they can get Japan to be loyal to them. The Mongols also felt that they were liberators of places that they went to. Like they were like baffled by the way that rebels in the southern part of China and the Southern Song like existed, because they'd be like, why are they so mad? Like, we came to liberate you. Which is an interesting parallel, by the way, about how many different groups in history have created their own, title as a liberator, and how many of them actually are.
Since these were the same stories the Romans were told about Britain. But while the Celts left Caesar disappointed, the Japanese would leave Kublai furious. In 1266, he sent some envoys who the Japanese didn't even bother responding to. Kublai kept rolling for that critical charisma hit in 1268 and 1271, but I guess that failed, since the Japanese literally beheaded the envoys. Wow. A few decades earlier, the entirety of Iran was wiped off the map because a governor decided to give a Mongol emissary a shave. So Kublai ordered his Korean vassals to build a fleet.
Oh. Khwarezmian Empire. If you guys have never heard of that name before, there's a reason. They were obliterated. And one of the people amongst many that found out if you mess with the Mongols, you find out.
Korea did, but not before starting a rebellion and telling the Japanese about it. Snitches. The first invasion in 1274 was very much the appetizer. A fleet of about 800 ships carried about 20,000 troops.
I think I've seen that up to about 30,000.
Mostly carrying Chinese and Korean troops. But fine, Kublai was still calling himself Mongolian, and there were a few horse boys in there, I guess. So let's just call this a Mongol invasion.
Well, remember too that much of Mongol fighting force were basically converted people. They routinely did that. In fact, they even basically converted over people that, that had fought against them. Hey, this guy was a good warrior. If he pledges his allegiance to us and take care of him, okay, we'll put him, we can put him in our military. If he doesn't, obviously they're going to kill him. But yeah, in a lot of cases too, they would basically use their enemies' people to fight their enemies, the same enemies. Famously, like Chinese engineers were used to build siege weapons to siege other Chinese cities. And again, all done with a mix of fear and intimidation for getting those type of people to even work for them in the first place. But nevertheless, was a very important force in their whole imperialism.
Why not? After taking a few islands, the invaders reached Hakata Bay, the only place where you could land an army and clash with the local clans. As the invaders' ship neared, Japanese onlookers recoiled in horror. Scores of captain women from Tsushima and Iki were strung up on the bows, ropes threaded through holes punched in their hands.
I haven't heard this story.
Used as a human shield. Ironically, it was the Japanese who fielded more mounted archers, who decimated these attackers with their sharpshooting.
By the way, people forget too that the samurai were largely like horseback archers. It's very famous with the steel katanas and all that stuff. But yeah, primarily were horseback archers, incredibly good at it.
Mounted archers who decimated these attackers with their sharpshooting. Chinese engineers deployed grenades, which were pretty ineffective. Using their sheer
infancy
numbers,
of gunpowder
the Mongols
weaponry
pushed the Japanese back several miles, driving them inland toward the Mizuki fortress. But by nightfall, progress had stalled. The Mongol commander took an arrow to the face, supplies dwindled, and as the Japanese resorted to night attacks on their warships, the decision was made to pull back.
We out!
What happened next is pretty debatable. Some sources claim a sudden typhoon hit the bay as the Mongols were sailing back home and destroyed a portion of their fleet. But one, that claim is extremely questionable due to the legends that were started later. And two, this happened outside typhoon season, so I kind of doubt this. Either way, the attack was over.
Interesting.
Divine wind or not, the Japanese defenders prevailed, despite their heavy casualties, and the Mongols, but really Chinese and Koreans, were left back on the mainland.
You'd think, with the story of like the typhoons stuff, which account, or I guess which side, if you're talking about Mongol versus Japanese, would benefit, I guess, most by that tale about being destroyed by, typhoons? Would it be the Mongols and say, hey, it's not because we were bad fighters. Now he's got me thinking about farts. But no, it was supernatural, I guess, in general. Or does that make you actually look worse? Oh, we got destroyed in a storm. We're the greatest army ever. It's like, who could benefit from that more? Then you look at the Japanese side. When you could benefit, it'd be like, hey, in our culture, we have this incredible reverence, for nature. Maybe those like forces, are on our side, showing that we are the good ones. We are the people that are blessed. I guess it could kind of go both ways. I don't know. Who do you think the story, I guess, benefits / hurts the most about it being storms that destroyed this invasion.
Kublai kept making threats, sending more messengers in 75 and 79, and heads continued to roll. The Great Khan was kind of looking more like a desperate ex, but by this point his conquest of China was complete, and Mongol heritage was completely tossed aside.
All right, which one of y'all? There's got to be some Mongol history enjoyers here. How many of you have the Genghis full body pillow in your bed at night?
Now he could focus his entire might across the Channel waters.
Yeah.
Like the Spanish, French, and Germans after him, he was obsessed with the idea of conquering this nearby island, the last thorn in his side, the jewel in his crown. To do so, he leaned on his Korean vassals again, this time also mobilizing the newly conquered southern Chinese.
By the way, history of Korea has been so much of, being like these vassal or tributary states by other powers. Brings in a lot of the identity that's even used in the modern sense with the communist movement. It's going to start in the 20th century, just as a response to just years of imperialism by the Japanese, most recently, centuries of with China, then also with the Mongols. Makes a lot more sense when you look at a more extreme, regime like you have in North Korea, and how they can build their platform of trying to be self-sufficient and autonomous from the empires that have surrounded them throughout their history.
Again, this time also mobilizing the newly conquered southern Chinese. Just imagine that. This would be like if Napoleon told Spain to give him an armada right after he, oh wait, never mind. While the Tang were the inventors of paper currency.
Well, the thing is, the dissenters are all gone. That's how that works there. You're left with, the silent majority, and then with collaborators. So what's left? Yeah. People that can, I guess, be bent to your will.
The Yuan dynasty skyrocketed its use. Here, the emperor drove up inflation by printing a shit ton of cash in order to finance his little dream.
That doesn't work.
But how big was the second invasion really?
Weimar Republic problems.
Some claim that the Korean fleet had 900 ships carrying 40,000 troops, while the Chinese fleet...
By the way, they, when they had gone back the first time, basically just kept making more preparations to build a fleet. They want to build one much bigger than the first one. It took years and years and years, and it's about 8 years, I believe, between that first one invasion and now they're getting a second one. But Kublai never wanted to give up on this, at least not yet.
Fleet was made up of 3,500 ships carrying 100,000 troops.
Yeah.
Now, without a doubt, these numbers are grossly exaggerated. Still, we are talking colossal numbers here. But that being said, these are not Admiral Yi level ships.
Unfortunately, those don't exist yet. God, I love the turtle ships.
But that being said, these are not Admiral Yi level ships.
I love the Korean turtle ships. How fun are they, by the way, in Age of Empires? If you guys ever play with Korea in it, you got to get the turtle ships. Make sure you get yourself a nice naval map. Dude, these things are goated.
Most ships, especially in the Southern Fleet, were hastily refitted river barges. As for the fighters, that 3% Mongolian is kind of 1% at best.
Naval force.
This was not some Mongol horde. These were substandard fighters carried on substandard ships coming from 2 different locations, and this time...
By the way, you see Tsushima, if you guys know. By the way, Ghost of Tsushima, what a great game. One of my favorite games, that entire video game generation. Right there, you see how we're saying it was kind of like the middle between the Korean Peninsula and southern Japan.
They sailed during typhoon season. There was nothing Mongolian about this operation.
Now, can typhoons not happen? If I said, I do have a question for you guys. Do typhoons only happen in the narrow typhoon season? Can they happen in other times? That I don't know. We're my meteorologists. Let me know.
There was nothing Mongolian about this operation, but if I said, what if the Yuan invasions were successful, you wouldn't be watching this video. So what about the Japanese? The epic katana-wielding samurai. The shogunate was basically two different governments ruling over a bunch of clans. But the first invasions and continuous emissaries did give them such a scare that they spent a majority of their budget building a seawall, preparing for another attack. Things were close the first time around, and despite their victory, those human meat shields, poison arrows, and literal bombs gave the Japanese a real scare. They knew the Yuan were coming. Hell, they even knew where they would strike, but they had no idea when. Soldiers spent years on guard duty, staring at the waves while they hit the shore. Their entire families moved to the western provinces. Hundreds of shrines were built and priests prayed around the clock, cursing their enemies. I'm serious, they had a system where at least one guy had to be praying while the others ate and slept.
Oh wow.
Then the moment they were all waiting for
That's interesting.
finally came. On June 1281, the Korean fleet, eager to gain glory,
1274 was the first one, right?
Before the rendezvous point, and followed the same path as the first invasion. Only this time, they met a much larger force behind thick stone walls.
Yeah. Now, that is not something new for the Mongols. They've been sieging walled cities and have been experts at it. But obviously, doing it from an amphibious invasion, that's going to be extra difficult. You know, you don't get your trebuchets and stuff.
For over a month, they couldn't even breach the wall. The deck of their ships bombarded by arrow volleys.
For sure.
The disorganized force of samurai, most of which were there only for the money, managed to hold ground and even rolled up at night, boarding enemy ships and cleaning out their decks.
Dang.
By late July, the Southern Armada finally showed up, swelling the invasion force. To the
you know, he's talking too about how much of this is like Chinese in that sense. And that makes sense. I mean, China, the naval power of the region as well. Their ships were some of the best quality that existed in, of course, in East Asia, but also even if you counted that into like the Indian Ocean, especially things like trade ships, big, large, junk ships as they were called. So yeah, one of the Mongols' things was using the skills and the technologies and the things that their enemies were experts at, and then sort of absorbing that and also disseminating it across. Right when they go into China and do their invasion there in the early 1200s, this is where we saw some of the first gunpowder, at least experimentation happening. Right, gunpowder famously is going to start in China. The Mongols are going to try to innovate with it, and then that technology is going to spread westward into kind of the Central and Middle Eastern Islamic world, pretty quickly making its way to Europe when you start seeing in conflicts like the 100 Years' War in the 1300s. All happening pretty quickly. The Mongols were the facilitators of all that.
Defenders, the sea filling up with thousands of ships must have been a sight to see. But what came next was even more astonishing. The combined force clashed with the defenders in mid-August, barely making gains, and then suddenly, 2 days after the main battle, kamikaze did show up. This time, nature did play its hand, and it obliterated the Yuan fleet.
Makes you think that since there's more confirmation of it happening in the second invasion, that then would make it more likely that's what happened before in the first one.
While it was anchored too, ships smashed into each other as the chains they were bound with turned them into death traps. Tens of thousands drowned or washed up on shore.
The Mongols ain't
captured and enslaved.
Swimming too good.
By some estimates, 2/3 of the entire force were lost in a single night.
And they've been building ships for years.
Their prayers were answered. The gods intervened, and this moment would be mythologized for centuries.
It makes sense in the Japanese culture, there's deep respect for nature because of just how geography of Japan is. This is a volcanic region. So there's going to be earthquakes, there's volcanic eruptions, all things that are very, mysterious without knowing about the science and plate tectonics and things like that. You're going to have tsunamis that may happen abruptly. You know, having a deep respect for the power of nature is going to happen in your culture when that is what your culture was built in the midst of. That makes sense. That there's so much interesting in the history of how religious beliefs develop and how it ties to the geography of those places. One of the famous ones is about Egypt, the Nile, geographically, this incredible river. It flows gently. It floods predictably. It's easy to predict. It's easy to maintain. It's great. What controls, the rivers? Well, the gods do. And if the rivers are great, and they definitely seem beneficial for us and almost designed to be beneficial for us, the gods that control those must be kinder characters. Well, go up to their neighbors in the northeast of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates, they flood violently and unpredictable. Well, it sure sounds like the gods aren't great benevolent beings there. So we better be worshiping them, and it's going to be scary. Oh, and by the way, the afterlife is probably a scary place because, these gods who are always cursing us are, in that midst where, again, go to Egypt, and it's much more of a peaceful place because if the gods are good, then maybe the afterlife is nice. I always love hearing about that connection of geography and religion.
The Yuan invaders weren't around for long, but while they were the embodiment of evil. Tough, merciless opponents who were defeated by a combination of preparation, courage, and divine intervention. Kublai was furious and started actually planning another invasion. Third time's the charm, right? But not long after, he faced disaster in Vietnam and Java too. Then he lost his wife, his heir, and turned to drinking. Neither he nor Japan were ever the same again.
I mean, they're only going to hold on to China for another 50 years or so. The Mongols only ruled for about 100 years or so. I mean, China hated every minute of being ruled by the Mongols. Even if the Mongols are like, why? What are y'all complaining about? We're your liberators. It's like, well, you're foreign occupiers that completely devastated entire cities. You can't kill us into being your friends. But yeah, much bigger fish to fry.
But what if he succeeded?
And they're going to collapse, start collapsing.
What if the divine wind that showed up to save Japan never showed up? Things are about to get ugly.
So it's just
History
a fair
really
fight
delivered
that
on
way?
this epic clash.
Fair
However,
fight.
we did miss out on what could have been possibly the most Pyrrhic victory of all time. Since both sides survived, we have a lot of texts describing the situation. And both Chinese and Japanese chroniclers were describing that August situation as absolutely dire. Both sides were exhausted. No rice was being sold at stalls. Neither side really wanted to be there. It just sucked. For the Japanese, their concept of a unified Japan was as foreign as Greece was for the Athenians.
Exactly. You know what's interesting about that too, the similarity, and we talk about this in my classes, is how geography impacted the lack of unification in both Greece and Japan. So like Greece, Japan is mountainous. It's like 4/5 of it is mountainous, which means travel is slower, it's more difficult, it's more divisive of a geography, which lends itself to less interaction between different regions. It also makes it very competitive for the regions that are going to be productive to things like large scale agriculture, like what was going to happen in Greece. And that also means that those people that can control those small percentages of that pristine territory are going to become powerful people. This is where you're going to get noble classes are going to be born. And like in Japan, this is where you're going to start getting a upper class of society of people that own and can protect and operate territory that are going to be lords, the daimyo. It's going to support the feudalism that's going to be the major structure of Japan, with instead of the, large centralized state that you're not going to see really till around 1600 with the Tokugawa. But you're talking centuries and centuries of feudal warfare and city-state development.
They were protecting lands far from their own in the hope of trading some Chinese ears for horse, or better yet, land. The morale for the Chinese and Koreans was even
you could
worse.
trade with them without conquering
After all,
them.
they were both recently conquered by a foreign invader who was trying to fit in. So let's say the typhoon never strikes. Don't expect a Yuan steamroll. Both invasions crawled, struggling to even take small islands like Tashima and Iki, despite clear advantages. Besides, they chose to sail in the middle of typhoon season. Do we really just enter God mode and stall the weather for a full year?
I'll just not go then.
I mean, I could, but I'm not, especially when there's such a much easier solution to this. And it gives us the same effect.
Not go
Have
then.
the southern makeshift fleet arrive at the exact time as the Korean one in June.
Okay.
In our timeline, the moment the two forces converged, the invaders started seeing actual real results. Now, this doesn't mean that the Japanese collapse all of a sudden. Oh no. Evidence shows that as the Divine Wind was putting the armada in the washing machine, a sizable reinforcement was making its way from the east.
Right.
After all, the shogunate had a clear answer to the Yuan question.
Or loyalty in Japan. Okay, you don't have these, like this centralized state, but the shogun is basically this term isn't really accurate, but a national authority figure. You know, Japan had an emperor, but was largely a cultural, religious kind of figurehead. But the shogun, who is the supreme military commander in Japan, he was the one wielding, you know, real power in Japan. And samurai and their daimyo that they were, you know, sworn oaths to, and the daimyo that swore oaths to the shogun, were all able to be mobilized, you know, under a person, under a shogun. So this was a permanent class of society, you know, these samurai, ready to be called really at any minute's notice. I mean, they're a professional, trained class of society ready for this, which, regardless of the geography, makes Japan a much more difficult place to attack than a lot of the people that the Mongols have had even invaded. I mean, there were professional standing armies, and of course, these large empires like in the Song Dynasty in China. But you think maybe a smaller place like Japan, that wouldn't be as big of a deal, but their structure is in such a way where they're almost like embracing this scenario that they've been preparing for forever.
The initial brunt was met by samurai volunteers who were manning the walls with nothing to do for months. We could expect an actual defending force that would come in to reinforce in far better condition with superior leadership. So what happens? June. Tashima and Iki Islands fall, and the wall at Hakata Bay is overwhelmed by a swarm of Yuan forces.
Okay.
Normally, the amphibious assault is the hardest part, followed by a
scenario is no storms, and the fleets come at the same time.
The next line of defense would be the powerful Mizuki Fortress, supported by natural choke points like river crossings and the hilly terrain of northern Kyushu.
Japan's just full
the
of that
shogunate
stuff.
would bankrupt
Easily
itself
defendable that way.
on this decade-long project of fortifying the island, and that would certainly pay off here. Chinese engineers would be more than equipped to handle these challenges, as long as there was an adequate supply line maintained with Korea. Right. But unfortunately for them, you can't hold back the Divine Wind. Not in this region, and not during the season.
Divine Fart
In
Wind.
mid-August, the majority of the ships are still destroyed. But by this point, a significant portion of the island, mainly the western portion of it, is in Yuan hands. Not all ships are lost, and
Port Nagasaki, very important port region, just historically. It's also the place where other foreign countries were allowed to, you know, trade into. It's often where you went. Even when the Tokugawa come into power and ban trade with the West, you know, famously the Dutch were allowed to, you know, come in, and they would go into that area around Nagasaki. It was like the only place they were allowed to. That's like the lifeblood port for them, at least in that part of Japan. You can go around to like Tokyo Harbor, but that's a lot further.
Actually, most of the invasion force is safely ashore, but still, not a great situation for the Chinese. This is when guerrilla warfare kicks in, as silent bands of samurai pick foragers off one by one. Both sides are heavily invested in this fight, and neither can pull back now. The shogun calls in more and more fresh troops to move to the west, while Kublai Khan ferries fresh troops and supplies to Kyushu. As the fight drags on and the food supplies dwindle, both sides begin to face the consequences of their actions. Samurai who previously refused the call are now in active rebellion against a shogun who is starving them in order to defend other clans. Southern China.
You guys believe that? Do you think the Bushido Code is going to be that conditional? I don't know.
In Korea just have enough of the Khan's demands. Corruption sets in as the quality of the ship and troops deteriorate more and more.
Down to rafts.
Through sheer numbers and at the expense of the greater Yuan domain, the defenders are pushed back, losing the strategic strait connecting the island to Honshu. Yuan vessels do block the straits and suffocate the gateway to Japan, with mounting casualties and hunger combined with the ruthlessness of the Yuan.
Now, when I first kind of heard of, like, what if the Mongols were able to conquer Japan, I definitely thought that, like the storm, I guess, question would come into play. And I've already been bringing up, as you notice in this video, about so many things that would make Japan difficult to conquer. So, like, was this going to be one of those things where from the get-go I was going to be like, no, like, like this wouldn't have happened no matter what. I won't say that, just because literally as the Crash Course World History meme has gone down, the Mongols are the exception to everything. Like, so many things just don't apply to them. And it'd almost be like stupid to discount them, because time and time again, it seems that they, just are victorious when the odds are against them. Just betting against them just does not ever seem like a good idea. And at least up to this point, I'm still afraid to do that, like to bet against them, just knowing what we know about their history. So we'll see, as this goes on, what things seem like plausible that could happen here.
Casualties and hunger combined with the ruthlessness of the Yuan, who raise cities refusing to collaborate. It's not long before certain clans just
Japanese castles
to their cause. Clans who feel that the shogunate has abandoned them, or that their cause is absolutely hopeless.
Well, here's the one thing. I mean, if the samurai or whatever are going to be in rebellion against the shogun, I don't think that's necessarily going to then lead to them being collaborators with the Japanese, or with the Mongols, or the Yuan by extension here. Their connection and their code is still to the people. It's still to Japan itself, with death being the only outcome of defeat.
Has abandoned them, or that their cause is absolutely hopeless.
Right.
Remember here, in this alternate timeline, the gods have not intervened, and with each captured city, the Yuan marched hundreds of meat shields towards the next. After the loyal Shimazu clan is defeated and their capital Satsuma is turned to rubble, shockwaves are sent throughout the island. For the Japanese, who have never been invaded by a foreign foe, the conquest of Kyushu is a major psychological blow. Minor clans like Edo and Aso are given an opportunity to rise above their station, becoming Yuan vassals.
And boy, a lot of people did, and just the history of places that Mongols, ruled over. You may talk a big game, but when you start seeing what the Mongols do, you start seeing them roll up into the gate, I think a lot of your courage is gonna go away, and it's understandable. But are the Japanese an exception due to their loyalty? Where is their line going to be to surrender, to capitulate, to collaborate? Do you think it's further back than most of the other cultures that the Mongols had encountered in their conquests?
The Yuan paused their campaign for the winter, but around April the following year, the war continues on. Japan raises new defenses and prepares an even greater force, but this time, the typhoon threat is far smaller. Casualties, defections, guerrilla warfare, famine, disease, destruction, rinse, and repeat. Historical records in our timeline note that Kublai appointed a Chinese general, Hung Chai-chiu, as commander of Japan, ahead of the invasion. Okay. Essentially, he was a governor in waiting. Right. In this alternate timeline, we can imagine this Yuan governor now declaring Kyushu as a province. He might send messengers to the Japanese imperial court in Kyoto and the shogunate in Kamakura with an ultimatum: submit to Mongol rule or face the same fate as Kyushu.
That's exactly what I would expect too. Exactly what I would expect. The Mongols like to avoid war. I mean, they really do. For as much as they're good at it and how bloodthirsty it seems they are, they would love to not have to do it. But you are going to have to do what they say. You have to be a vassal to them. And a lot of places felt, okay, that's fine, especially with a lot of the ways that the Mongols maybe weren't as oppressive as some other places. Which isn't saying much, though. Like, we're not going to, convert your religion or something. We'll actually let you keep a lot of your institutions and all that. But, except that, we're the ones in charge, though.
Refusal will be madness.
And that is usually the other
he's sending heads
option
instead of receiving them. Those are the leading clans tasked with defending the province. Hojo Tokimune's government proclaims they will never surrender the homeland of the gods. They call on every last samurai and peasant to resist the barbarian pirates.
Bringing up the peasants.
It's a very
now.
300 style rallying cry.
Sure.
Madness? This is Japan. This relentless cycle of fueling the fire doesn't stop while Kublai Khan lives. Japan is his obsession, like Xerxes, consuming most of his resources and focus. It may take another year or two, or maybe even a decade, but nothing but unconditional surrender can stop this juggernaut. Now, normally this isn't the end of the world. Korea faced a similar fate and managed to come out on top. Only this isn't Korea. In our world, the invasions gave Japan an existential crisis. Its leadership saw the failure in its political system and bankrupted itself building walls and shrines for protection.
Already is interesting is what similarities there might be to what actually happened in the mid-19th century. Americans show up, Commodore Perry shows up, pretty much forced the shogun into granting access to their country. Shogun is actually seen as weak and ineffective and is thrown out of power. Basically ineffective in protecting Japan, paving the way for the Meiji Restoration in the Japanese Empire. So we have like future precedent, if you will, of something similar to this.
Families were moved west and feudalism was bootstrapped in order to have a small standing army. Similarly to how the Vikings accelerated feudalism in Europe. The shaky balance between the two...
If you don't understand what feudalism basically is instead of having large centralized states, you have smaller areas run by powerful people. We call them lords in Europe. They're called the daimyo in Japan. And they sort of rule more in a much smaller scale. And their people are loyal to them. And in turn, they are given protection. You're basically vassals, right? You have a relationship with each other. You're codependent on each other. And this often happens in the vacuums that pre-existing central authorities existed once. When the Western Roman Empire fell, you didn't have this large state basically protecting and operating an enormous part of Europe. So it kind of disintegrates into, okay, how can I survive without a large centralized state? And that usually means locally collaborating with each other, allying with those that are powerful, that can protect you. And then naturally that just kind of happens. And that's what happened in Japan. It's not like Japan and Europe had been talking about systems and sharing ideas. These just happen naturally.
How the Vikings accelerated feudalism in Europe. The shaky balance between the two seats of government were shattered. The emperor became a figurehead, with the shogun now the one truly in charge.
It was always like that.
These paranoid policies led to a desire to climb the ladder. And the Sengoku Jedi period began. Thousands of disenfranchised samurai saw their fortune decline as power went into the hands of the clergy, courtiers, and moneylenders. I know it's hard to imagine, But
Never
this
played the
Game of
Yakuza
Thrones
game.
style madness
cool, though.
between Tokugawa and Nobunaga is even more chaotic in 1281. What that means is that in
Accelerates
this
it.
alternate timeline, the Yuan dynasty finds it difficult to get an unconditional surrender.
So kind of saying that maybe this accelerates the centralization of Japan. Again, that we don't see for a couple hundred years in our real life timeline. I'm not opposed to that idea.
The Yuan dynasty finds it difficult to get an unconditional surrender. Instead, Kublai Khan kind of finds himself in an endless game of whack-a-mole. The solution to that game is very Mongolian, which is burn them all. The Yuan will always eventually fall. The pathetic successors of Kublai Khan, followed by the Black Death, which originated in China, basically guaranteed that. In fact, having him spend so much resources on Japan would probably move that time frame forward a few decades, leading to...
Famously, the plague, hits Europe in the 1330s, coming from the east, where it had been years before, and did devastate China. So, yeah, interesting how these other timelines are now starting to cross each other.
An earlier rise of the Ming. All in all, for most of Asia, the consequences are pretty minimal. Indochina and Java don't get invaded, and the Yuan fall a bit sooner, but that's no big deal. For Japan, though, ouch. There are no proud myths or legends to unite the people, no cultural or political renaissance. Clans are fractured by Yuan manipulation. Resources are depleted and carried off to Beijing. But most of all, I think there's going to be a Khwarezmian or Hungarian level population decline.
Ooh. Now that would be then an intentional slaughter, with a response by the Mongols claiming that, they were the ones, the other ones are the ones that started the fight, because that's what happens. Mongol envoys, going to those regions, they get attacked, and then the Mongols come back with, an incredible amount of violence. And I guess that would happen, especially if the peace negotiations that are going to be offered to Japan are going to be rejected, because we have plenty of precedent that, that's how the Mongols would have responded, is just by slaughtering everybody. Slaughtering everybody both involved in that process and the innocent.
Anywhere from 50 to 75% as a whole, with huge contrast between one province and another. While this invasion preceded many samurai customs, many believed in that last stand mentality.
Sure.
As evidenced by the
would be that.
Tsushima garrison, which fought to the last man, with its commander even committing seppuku. Some clans bend,
I would think there'd be a lot of
others
that.
break. Holy sites, key castles, and anything that can inspire resistance is torn down. Only the Yuan could pull this off, which means that after they collapse, half a century later, there is no danger.
1368 is when the Yuan dynasty collapsed to the Ming. So there's rebellions. Ming dynasty is going to reclaim or claim China. Internal rebellions. Mongols had, the Mongols had fractured so much by then. And other parts of what was their empire, of their newly conquered empire, Mongols basically just assimilated into the local cultures almost seamlessly, where in China, they tried to rule a lot more directly. There was far less assimilation.
That after they collapse, half a century later, there is no danger of the Ming ever attempting a sequel. Given enough time, Japan could end up piecing itself back together.
Like the Ming
Just
are
think
not
of how
going
the
to care
Mongol
about
invasions of the Rus eventually led to the establishment of Russia.
By the way, I totally agree that when the Ming would, come into power, which they would regardless, I think, of the Japan situation. That they would not be concerning themselves with Japan, because what you're going to see fairly early in the Ming, few years into the Ming rule, was them turning away from those foreign interactions. Famously, they recalled the fleets of Zheng He, the greatest navigator and naval traveler, basically, of the era. Recall all of those connections, dismantle ships, rebuild the Great Wall of China, try to rid the Mongol influence and the foreign influence out of the country, and really try to solidify and defend themselves, and do less interaction with the foreign barbaric cultures that inevitably the Ming would have thought of everywhere else, including Japan. So yeah, it would be over. Definitely see that happening.
This is a comparison filled with similarities, both with a very long and bloody process. In our timeline, Japan's isolation actually saved it from the Black Plague, but here it receives a horrific parting gift. And because in this alternate timeline they are Yuan vassals for about 40 years, they barely get to reap the benefits of the Silk Road.
Yeah,
no matter how you look at it, the best case scenario for Japan here is it being an isolated, divided, and battered island, one with a recovering population and shattered cultural identity by 1510.
Well, the Ming, who again are going to replace the Yuan, were not like against trade. They wanted to get back to what China traditionally had been, which is as an exporter country, as having that type of surplus. In the Mongol years, so much was also coming into China. People, goods, all of those things. Having a far more, I guess, balance of like import versus export. And the Ming wanted to, get back to those older ways. So they still would be fine, like, sending stuff to Japan. And they have no problem giving you stuff, but they don't want your stuff.
This is not a unified state, mind you. This is just a reset back to where it was before Kublai even showed up. This is pretty bad news, considering that at best, Japan gets like 40 years before the Portuguese arrive.
Right.
What's pretty likely is that they are still in the middle of rebuilding by the time Europeans show up. In our timeline, the Portuguese and Dutch faced a unified Tokugawa shogunate.
Ooh, that brings in a great question. Would Japan have been more susceptible to like European colonization of Japan because they were in such a weakened state? Shoot, could they have pulled off something like, what happened? What happened with the Spanish in the Inca Empire, where, in a very timely nature for the Spanish had showed up with Francisco Pizarro at a time where the Inca Empire was extremely fractured. They just got on a civil war, and they were able to use that fragmentation to their advantage to be able to take over the whole empire completely. Now, the big kicker, of course, was the disease, which wouldn't have had that much as much of an impact as it did in the Americas. It's going to have in Japan, but it could have made Japan far more vulnerable to European pressure, which already was kind of growing. You remember, if there was quite a bit of interaction in those original decades with Europeans coming in the 1500s. But it's that growing pressure that leads them to, eventually cast them out. But, would they have been more entrenched, and it would have been harder to expel the Europeans like they do end up doing under the Tokugawa? That's an interesting thought. Let's see if he gets into that a little bit more. Would Japan have been more susceptible to European colonization and exploitation that maybe like we saw in China, for example?
In our timeline, the Portuguese and Dutch faced a unified Tokugawa shogunate, a wary, xenophobic Japan with a rigid hierarchy and robust population. But here they come to a miserable and divided island, one where Jesuits may be able to speak to friendly ears, and guns may be sold in plenty. The combination of Yuan persecution of the
famously, the fighting forces in the Americas, of the Spanish, was by recruiting dissented people in those areas. It happened with the Aztec Empire, happened with the Inca Empire. That I don't know you would have that type of success at that type of alliances in Japan that the Europeans saw, though, with the Americas. I don't think that would happen.
Japanese gods in plenty. The combination of Yuan persecution of the Japanese gods, failure of the priests to save their homeland, and overall horrible century following the invasion creates an environment where the people kind of need a savior, or at the very least they need an explanation for the suffering. Some clans may reject the Jesuits, but others will welcome them with open arms, far more than they did in our timeline.
There was actually a pretty strong amount of people in Japan that did end up converting to Christianity. It was one of the big threats the Japanese government saw was, the excessive amount of conversions, which they believe would be a major issue for loyalty if Japanese people were, becoming Christians and Catholics specifically, because they're going to, tie loyalty to like the Vatican, to the Pope, rather than to a Japanese shogun, Japanese emperor.
Will welcome them with open arms, far more than they did in our timeline. Speaking of arms, competing clans would bend over backwards to gain the favor of the Europeans. Being friends with the Europeans means getting hands on those boomsticks. And with Japan in chaos, we are talking about a series of far more devastating alternate
The Japanese
wars.
love the European
I can imagine
guns,
the Portuguese, Dutch, Spanish, English, and French running their tentacles deep. Japan becomes a battleground where the clans act as pawns. By the end of the 16th century, the question isn't which part embraces the Europeans. It's which empire each province has decided to support.
It kind of seems like, okay, so actually supporting. So they're saying they do create a bunch of alliances here. This is where I was a little bit like, I don't know. But are these just going to be like more like small colonies here, or resemble more like the spheres of influence that are going to happen in China? Either way, there'd have to be European collaboration in this. Similar, I guess, to what would happen with the scramble for Africa in the 1800s.
Now, let's get even more specific here. In our timeline, Macau became a major trading post, followed by many others. Considering the Yuan devastation,
the Chinese forced the Europeans to trade there,
like Kyushu and Tsushima, doesn't it kind of make sense for these natural harbors to become major trading outposts? Old Yuan bases become pirate coves, and in the eyes of the daimos, the Portuguese are only doing them a favor by taking them out. Little do they know, or maybe they do and they just can't do anything about it, once the Europeans settle in, no Eastern Navy is ever gonna threaten them again. The Ming could roll up with 1,000 junk ships, and that's all that they would ever have.
They already struggle with it anyway.
Within a century, the archipelago, once shielded by divine whims, is swept by another force. The sails of European ambition. Maybe Portuguese Tsushima becomes a hub for missionary work and arms dealing. Perhaps Dutch Kyushu transforms into a commercial fortress, defended by Protestant guns and Japanese mercenaries. I could see Spanish-backed Christian enclaves popping up in Shikoku and Honshu, flying crosses next to clan banners. Who knows, maybe if the timeline even gets wackier, maybe...
It does make me wonder if the suspicion that the Japanese government had about loyalty of Japanese Christians was actually warranted, because it does seem like in this scenario that there's going to be a significant level of new loyalty to these Christian nations. Would it be of a loyalty though direct to like the Pope themselves, or more just like Spanish, Portuguese monarchies? But I guess in a way where the Japanese right to fear the loyalty of Japanese Christians. And we know in our real life scenario, they went on a massive persecution effort when they closed off the European access to a massive persecution of Japanese Christians for that exact reason.
Maybe we might see a Christian emperor propped up by the Jesuits, and also Iberian silver. Perhaps
probably more
this
like a
Christian
viceroy.
Emperor claims divine mandate in Kyoto, even as the true emperor languishes under house arrest and obscurity. This is a situation that no one could really stop if it happened. The Ming might bluster, but their naval expeditions are a distant memory. Their ships are outnumbered by the Europeans and totally outgunned. In this alternate timeline, the Yuan destroyed Japan's cohesion, its identity, population, and industry. And now, this isn't a nation anymore, it's a board game. Every clan a piece, the Portuguese, Dutch, Spanish, and Jesuits all taking a roll of the dice. And yet, this chaos does open a new can of worms. Who does win in Japan? How soon does Japan westernize? How do the Ming respond to Europeans building mini empires across the sea? Do these colonial proxy wars spill into Europe itself?
Well, Japan was able to industrialize because they rejected the colonization of from Europeans. You know, they were able to learn the technologies during the Meiji Restoration, but never allow itself to be ruled by these foreigners. So I don't think that it would have like jump-started their industrialization unless the Japanese were able to unify and drive out the Europeans. Because then there's a good chance you probably would see a movement towards industrialization, specifically to modernize in a sense that they won't be conquered in the future. What I think would be a more likely outcome is what happened to other colonies in European history that did, because they did not industrialize. They were having resources extracted from them that will fuel the Industrial Revolution back in Europe in the 17 and 1800s. It was never the goal to build up this kind of infrastructure and industrialize to the benefit of the colonized nation. That was never the design or the intention of European imperialism.
Just like it did with America. Do these colonial proxy wars spill into Europe itself, just like it did with America? If you think this video should have a sequel, become a patron and cast a vote. And if not, well, I'll leave it right here. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.
Final thoughts. All right, guys, it's always fun to talk about the Mongol Empire and, again, some of the great what-ifs. There's a lot of what-ifs that went around, I believe, East Asia at this time. You know, without that Mongol, I guess, bad taste that was left in the mouth, you know, in China, which leads to, you know, the Ming Dynasty not wanting to interact with foreigners again. You know, that recalls a lot of their foreign expeditions, which were just decades ahead, by the way, of European explorers. I mean, the stuff that Zheng He was doing was nearly a century before what Europeans are going to start to do. And that's one of my favorite what if scenarios is what if the Ming had not, you know, recalled Zheng He expeditions and actually expanded and invested more into foreign exploration? What if we do get the Chinese actually having like policies of colonization? Could have been around South Asia, around the Indian Ocean, you know, in general, East Africa, maybe to the Americas, going east. Could there be a colonization of the Americas by the Chinese? I mean, that's I think one of the greatest alternate history scenarios ever, because it completely changes the whole future of the world. Maybe a possible alternate scenario for my and our series over here. Told you guys there's a collaboration effort going on my originals channel for an alternate history series. We're always looking for good ideas about alternate history. I mean, Cody's basically hit, all the major ones, and now, you know, having to try to find other ones that would be important and relevant enough to, you know, make whole videos on and have a successful channel. It makes sense why, you know, he would be making content for another platform, I guess, like Patreon for some of these other ones, because you get to a point, if you've done this for years and years and years, that all of the big famous what if moments are going to be covered, and you got to find, you know, other ones there. So like for us, you know, developing alternate history, like how many scenarios do we want to do that have already been covered over and over again? Do we need another what if the Germans won World War II? So I do get, I guess, the predicament that he is. All right. So I shared, though, I think the things I would agree with, and maybe some of the things I maybe disagreed with. I find that with most of these videos, I find myself, I believe, agreeing probably more than I disagree, but I always find some kind of nuance with that. And I think that's fair. All right. And with that, you guys, we'll see y'all next time. Bye.